Doing fine, honestly.
Yeah.
Zoom is a weird platform. I don't know how to use it that well either. I'm just okay, camera's on, they can hear me. Good.
Done. Job done.
Namaste, hello, welcome to the third and the last day of the Roots and Soil Conference organized by Tattva, sponsored by Acorn Dental. For those of you who may not be familiar with Tattva, it is an ecosystem, it's an independent nonprofit where creative leadership is nurtured, and it's also where incubation of ideas take place, especially the ideas which are linked with the paradigm of dharma. So Tattva integrates a worldview which is rooted in the principle of interconnectedness, diversity, and sustainability. Part of Tattva's work is geared towards open incubation sessions, such as this one, where we explore a particular in an open-minded and critical way. In the last 2 days, the themes of migration and integration have been discussed in the conference. And today we discuss connection. As the word tattva suggests, we look for the essence of, as the word tattva actually means essence, we are going to look for the essence of the word connection. And to discuss that, I have a panel with me today. I am Manu Khajuria. I'm a political commentator and the author of an upcoming publication, Mountain Goddesses. I'm also the founder director of Voice of Dogras, which is a voice for the people of Jammu region in Jammu and Kashmir. With me is Laxmi Chhaya. Laxmi is a facilitator and a social researcher. Based between India and the UK, she works closely with grassroots organization on the development of skills among youth in India. She is currently head of program delivery Asia for the Princess Trust International. She is also a board advisor for the Rights Collective, which is a group looking to tackle distinct ways in which disempowerment and inequality manifests within the South Asian diaspora community in the UK. Over the last 15 years, Laxmi has lived in India for 5 years and Kenya for 2. Laxmi has an ongoing exploration with the idea of belonging and facilitating service leadership programs for British Indian youth and living in rural Gadchiroli in Maharashtra as part of a 1-year IndieCore fellowship has given Laxmi the space to unpick some of her own biases and to seek a meaningful connection to India. And then I have with me Parle. Parley Patel is an award-winning YouTuber, presenter, and producer. He's passionate about infusing his Gujarati heritage within the UK community and beyond that. Parle also founded the first Gujarati folk dance movement, Ras Rebellion, which aims to get creative with Gujarati song and dance in a new and exciting way. And in 2016, he also released his first song as a songwriter, music producer, and music video director. I don't speak Gujarati, but I managed to understand Parle's videos. So that's a credit to you, Parle. Welcome, both of you, Laxmi and Parle, to this session. And let me reiterate what the theme is for today. We are looking at connection. How do we stay connected to our ancestral homelands, especially after years of settling and integrating? How do we have a meaningful connection with our ancestral homelands? So my first question would be, to both of you, what do we understand from connection? How do we understand it? And what is it that we are trying to stay connected to? So Laxmi, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for bringing us all together, and thank you to all of those people who are listening to us instead of playing in the snow, if it's snowing where you are today. So I think this is a really good question, and it really kind of made me think a lot deeper about my understanding of connection. And I think when I think of connection, I think of it as being a relationship, you know, between two things. So like with any relationship, it's fluid, it's changing. We come with it, you know, bringing our own experiences. But especially when I think about my relationship with India, you know, I wouldn't say I always felt connected to India growing up. I felt like I almost inherited this emotion, you know, that was like given to me from like my parents, my grandparents. And in that way, it was definitely a diluted emotion, you know, because I didn't have those tangible experiences. You know, I hadn't spent that much time in India. And so I knew it was a significant place. And because it was significant to other people that are close to me, I felt like, you know, I should connect to it in some way. But over time, I think if I talk about the things that I want to be connected to, I wanted that relationship or that connection with India to be more deliberate, a bit more intentional. So this idea of not being like a tourist in a country where, you know, I felt deeply connected to, not looking at it through this more like Western lens. So, you know, whether that's kind of judging some of the choices that people are making there, or even sometimes like on the flip side, that whole romanticized view of India, right? You know, when we take a selfie with, you know, the kids and the cow and the jaiwala and, you know, everything, because it's so fascinating to us. And so over the time I think I've spent there, it's really made me try to kind of question some of my own assumptions that I'm making. And I think, you know, there's a really wonderful quote by Lila Watson, which you might have heard, which really I relate to, which is along the lines of like, if you've come to help me, you know, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let's work together. And I think for me, that's the part of India or my culture that I'm looking to connect to. I really see India as a place that is like a teacher or a guru, almost like a mirror that, you know, holds up, you know, really reflects all of you back to yourself, you know, the good, bad, and ugly. So I think what's also interesting to your question, Manu, is like, what are we choosing not to connect to? You know, there's a lot of India that we're probably like selectively, actively or not actively thinking about, or not thinking about. So yeah, I think that's kind of my thoughts on connection.
That's wonderful. You look at it as connecting to India, which is the teacher or the guru. Parley, what are your thoughts on this?
Fantastic thoughts by Laxmi there. Gosh, as much knowledge as your name. I think you made some wonderful points. For me personally, ever since I was little, my connection to India has always been there. I feel like my mom and dad have drip feeded it to me in the most beautiful way. I've never ever sort of grown up feeling like, oh, I wish I wasn't Indian, or I wish I could disconnect from my Indianness. And I feel like a part of the reason why is because my connection to India is so multi-layered. It's cultural, it's religious, it's artistic, it's political. There's so many like layers to what my connection to India is. So I feel like that is what then I have now sort of began to push out. And when I've begun to do that, I've realized that actually within each layer, there's even more layers, there's micro layers. So there's never been like a dull moment in kind of remaining connected, or kind of like, there's never been a moment where I've found it difficult to connect. I like what you said, Laxmi, as well, about how we actively sometimes pick what we want to remain connected to and what we don't want to remain connected to. And I think an important point there is that there's some things that we as British Indians will probably never understand because we don't have a lived experience in India. So the way I break down my connection personally is through kind of like 3 levels. To understand India as my Matrubhumi, or the motherland, the UK as my Janmabhumi, the country I was born in, and my Karmabhumi, the country that I work in, actually involves India, involves America, involves the UK. So there's this mixture. So I feel like, yes, India is the motherland. If it ever came to choose, I would still identify as an Indian. And that connection is something that I'm constantly maintaining, but as I said, through different layers and through different textures and styles. So it's not a one type connection, but it's from different kind of like worlds, you could say.
That's very interesting, because you've sort of pointed out the different levels of connection that we make, and that leads to my second question very smoothly. That is that there are so many connections that we make on different levels, and sometimes we choose not to make those connections. As Laxmi said, that we might choose not to make some connections. So can we say that connections that we make are dependent on the connection that we have with our own selves? So it's that connection with self that leads to these different other connections that we make, Laxmi?
Yeah, I think Yeah, coming back to actually Parle's point about the fact that we've, whether or not we've had these lived experiences in India are what really kind of, I think, shape. And then again, what Parle said was so true, that it's his family, it's our parents' generation and grandparents' generation that's really kind of shaped, I think, the way we're experiencing Indian culture. And then now our generation is kind of looking forward and, preserving it. And so I think the piece around the self is definitely there. I think there's such an interconnectivity between how we experience, in my case, how I'm experiencing India and what it means to what's going on inside myself. But I think there's a huge privilege that we have, right, around this piece, around getting to choose how we connect to India. And for example, like when India's winning cricket, all the blue shirts are out. I definitely felt like a real energy. I was in Kenya at the time when Modi ji came to the UK, and there was definitely this like huge energy around feeling proud of being Indian, and being connected to India. And then equally, I feel there are times where, India's struggling with something, and, India has its set of challenges, and some of these challenges are pretty complex. But, one example that comes to mind is when some of the more known rape cases that were happening in India, I really felt like as a British diaspora, like Indian diaspora here, those conversations were happening in this really kind of weird way for me. Either we just didn't talk about it, or we talked about it, but by creating this distance between us and India. We had this choice there around kind of like, do we want to be connected to that side of India as well? And then if I kind of go even deeper, I think sometimes like, do we recognize the role we play, and how some of maybe, for example, those gender differences exist in India? Do they also exist in our lives here? So I think absolutely connection, there needs to be a connection from the self. Like for me, it's definitely been a very personal, slow, reflective journey, and like I think Parle said, it's always happening. It's not something that you like a t-shirt you wear and then you take off and then you're not Indian anymore. You're constantly going through that journey, exploring your own Indianness. I love that actually. We have our own levels of Indianness, but I think it's also important to recognize that it has been shaped by our previous generations. And I'm kind of really interested in how do we take this privilege? How are we responsible now to kind of think about what are the future generations going to be experiencing, and how are we going to enable them to, what is the culture, Indian culture, that they're going to inherit as such from us?
That is so true. Like for me, because I grew up in India, I studied in India, my experiences are very different. And I was so connected to that part of me that for many years, it's been 17 years that I'm not living in India, I'm living abroad. I lived in the US and here for many years. And I think up until last year, I wouldn't say that I am here. I would say I currently reside in London, as if I am in a state where I'm going to go off to India any moment. So I had difficulty coming to terms with the fact that I have come here. So that was my experience. But Parle, do you think that because you've embraced yourself as that Gujarati, as that Patel, that you've accepted all the positives and the negatives, and because of your strong connection to self, you've been able to do what you do?
So I think just going back to what Laxmi said and pairing it with what you're saying, 100% with what you're saying, like I've deeply connected to myself. And there's when you really connect to yourself, you sort of accept your flaws, you kind of hold them, and look at those flaws and say to yourself that these are there, some which are really deep rooted, which don't directly come from your own people, with India's history and what India has seen over centuries, even thousands of years, is not all directly linked to you, but it's a conditioning that is now a part of you, if that makes sense. For me personally, one thing that was really, really important was to create a new independent relationship with India away from my parents, which sounds a bit strange because most children of Indian heritage in this country, their first trips to India are usually with their parents. And what happens with that is that connection that I was talking about earlier, being, you know, multi-leveled and with lots of texture, actually becomes really thin. It turns into a narrow connection where the experience you are receiving of India becomes the experience that your parents want you to have. And often this is a great experience because, you know, you get to experience how they grew up in India or your ancestral heritage, but India is so much more than that. So I remember the first thing that I did as soon as I graduated from university, I knew right then, whilst I was at university, that the first thing I want to do is go to India by myself without my parents. And it wasn't in that romanticized way that Laxmi was talking about, where I wanted to, you know, discover myself or take photos and that sort of thing. I just had this curiosity, like, and in my head, I call it beyond the Gam trip, or beyond the Gam, beyond the Pind, beyond the village. What is there? And at the end of that trip, I realized that one thing that I really always want to do is continue going back and forward to India and continue meeting people who are Indian, who have a very different Indian experience, and see if we find overlaps. And that's where I learned that actually some things you will struggle to understand because you've never, ever had those lived experiences. And some things you will actually understand in a very global way, that, oh my God, I'm in the UK, I'm an Indian and I'm a Gujarati, and you're an Indian and Gujarati in Mumbai, and you have the same experience, even if you're not a Gujarati person, even if you know, you're from Bangalore in the south. There was some things that just tied us all together. So I think that's how I explored it.
I was going to ask this question later, but I'm going to ask it now because you brought it up, Parle, about the physical experience. So, you know, the physical and social ties of the migrants' children are reportedly turning weaker because of their short length of residence in their ancestral home and a higher level of acculturation to the host society. So does one need to visit the ancestral homeland, Laxmi? Will it then complete that experience, and will it then give a true picture? Do we really need to visit it often, or are there other ways to stay connected?
I'm so biased in this. I'm going to not be so biased, but absolutely. Yes, I don't think, I reckon that not everyone can visit India or may not be able to visit often. But I just wanted to share something, because when I was listening to Parle and I could really relate to your experience of going to India with family and wanting to go alone and kind of developing your own relationship with this place. I remember as I started spending more time in India, and these are what were like the detours from what's like real life in the UK, and these are words that other people used, not necessarily me. I found that there was this really interesting negotiation process going with my parents, and I'm not sure if you guys can relate to this, but it was so interesting for me that I'd grown up in this very Gujarati household, you know, speak Gujarati at home, you know, very simple things from taking shoes off and, you know, at the door, and, you know, how we treat guests, and really loving India. But when I was deciding, you know, when I was kind of thinking about going there was this definite resistance from my parents. And that was the first time I kind of realized that actually Indian culture and India are not necessarily the same thing. And even though they're connected, there was this very kind of like the feelings that they were going through. And this is, I'm talking about 15 years ago or so, where I guess for them, it wasn't seen as like the best use of time. It wasn't seen valuable. So it was valuable for us to go to India, to visit our gams, as Parle said, and have those experiences. But to go there independently and spend an extended period of time, why are you doing this? You know, and so I absolutely do feel, you know, there is a need for us to get past these like wedding shopping trips and get past these like very and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely. Like I think it's great to go to India and be comfortable, but recognize like that's not the only part of India. It's important to kind of experience. And I think there's an opportunity right now for us as a diaspora to really think about what are those alternatives? What are the ways we're going to create chances for like parents or young kids or teenagers or youth to spend time in India, but in this slightly uncomfortable way, you know, step a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And we talk about India as this place, as this idea, and that's something I kind of struggle with, because it's very like generalized, you know, and you know, everyone knows India is so diverse, and it's definitely not like this single idea or the single concept. I think it's important to go there and actually see those different parts of India, and I definitely think there's room for us to push past some of where we've got to. You know, I think we need to push a bit further.
100% agree with what you said there. Yeah.
I will pop in a question from the audience because it's very related and relevant to what we are discussing right now. And the question is that as we are seeing third and in some cases fourth generation British Indians coming through, how can we enable this connection for them? And how big a part does the loss of language play in this?
That's a really good question for someone like myself who makes content in language. In fact, one of my biggest arguments with any large corporations I have worked with, not to name and shame, but even with the BBC, they would always refer to Indian vernaculars as language and English as English. And my biggest argument was that by doing this, you are saying that Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi, Bengali, Tamil are artificial to us, and they are not. Our languages are not artificial to us at all, in the sense that the Gujarati that we speak in our house is hugely important. And it's not to say that we need to learn in a formalized way where we are learning it in a literature way, but it's important to have that language because it opens up a very natural and easy sort of dialogue with India. For me personally, there's this misconception that I lived in India, or I was born in India, because I speak Gujarati quite well. But when I tell my audience that I've never actually formally learned Gujarati, and I've taught myself with, you know, the Gujarati alphabet chart and just reading children's books, because I'm so passionate about making sure that I can go to India and speak, or if there's anything I need to do in this country which requires someone young to speak in Gujarati, that I can step forward. But the truth is that that connection is something that we have been ignoring, and we've not seen a value. And I'm not blaming our parents for it, because our parents' understanding of what is valuable in terms of connection was do the bare basic and be successful. But I think the migrant community of Indians that has settled down in the UK has become, you know, strong, settled, and we now have that privilege to actually do these things, like actually connect to our heritage and give ourselves more time for those sort of things. And I just wanted to touch up on something earlier about the independent trips to India. I completely agree, trips to India are so important, but not everyone has the opportunity to travel and, you know, drop work and things like that. I completely understand, but independent trips don't have to be directly with India. One thing that I did was have independent visits with my grandparents. So rather than going to see my grandmother, my ba, when my mum and dad would go, or when my mum's going, I would go just independently. And what that would do is it would mean that I'm having a direct dialogue with her with nothing else sort of in that dialogue. It was like a total dialogue with just two people, and that really helped me. So if anyone's watching and going, well, I'm not going to go to India anytime soon and I want to live some of these experiences, then that's a great way. Find an elder or someone who you can have a dialogue with to ask your questions.
Yeah,
yeah,
sorry.
Laxmi, go ahead.
No, I actually agree with so much that Parle is saying, and I absolutely, I think language is such a like a gift. You know, I kind of I've said this to friends, but I do think like the language that's been passed down to me, I see that as like my inheritance. That, you know, my granddad especially really kind of forced us to speak Gujarati at home. You know, and at the time you're like, oh man, you know, I don't want to do this, but it really helped me when I went to India. You know, and to be able to speak to people and genuinely connect to people meant a lot to me. And I think it's I think language can also become a little bit of a crutch. Like for me, I wanted to just add to Parle's point. When I've been in Gujarat, it's been so great to be Gujarati and come with these like shared, shared experiences, whether it's like Garba or Gujarati food or Gujarati language. And it's only when I've spent time outside of Gujarat. I've lived in Gajroli, as you mentioned, and spent time in Kanpur and Bihar, and that's when I was stripped away from, from like language as my comfort zone, having these kind of things that I could rely on. And that's what it was those experiences that kind of pushed me to really look at India a little bit more than what was actually given to me. And I think that's also important. And sorry, coming again back to Parle's point, like absolutely spending time with grandparents is so incredible. It's such a kind of accessible thing, even our parents, I feel like they have so many stories to share. But, there's a word that Parle said, I wrote it down, like there needs to be a curiosity, and I think we have, there's so many things you can be curious about where language, if you don't speak the language, you can still be curious about music and art and kind of the history or architecture. I mean, there's no shortage of things to be curious about when it comes to any place, and especially India. So I think start with where you are, be curious, ask questions, challenge things as well. It's okay to challenge things. And I think that's equally like a really good place to start.
Yes, especially the bar part, the elders, because India is not just a political state. It's not a state made up of different Gujarat, Punjab, Haryana. It's a civilizational state. So when I listen to Parle talk about his bar or those performances, I can immediately connect, because that could be my grandmother in Jammu. So there is this civilizational connect. Now going back a little, how hard it is to stay connected when you're in a when your host culture is so different from your own self, which is connected to these norms and behaviors which are very, very different. So is there some sort of a guilt in being too connected to your ancestral homeland, and then people making it out as you won't integrate so easily? I was listening to yesterday's session, Jazz was conducting it, and she at one point said that, at some stage she felt she needed to be whitewashed so that she can be successful or fit in better. And I remember when I moved to the US, I was a young bride. And the first thing, and I moved in the middle of a snowstorm, it was February, and I realized when I looked at my wardrobe, it was just too colorful. Everywhere I looked around in the US, it was, black coats and beige color coats and brown. And here I had like these hot pinks and yellows and greens, and I felt I needed to change that. I was wearing anklets, and, I would announce my arrival because of those anklets. And I thought I had to remove that. So can it be seen that if you're too connected, there will be a problem with integration? What are your thoughts on that? How hard or easy is it to stay connected to this aspect of our ancestral homeland or culture?
You want to go, Parle? Or I'm happy to.
That's a really good one. That's my middle name, this question that you've asked. I think growing up in Britain, being born here as well, you are often looked down upon if you are over connecting or too Indian or too desi, as some people refer to it. But I feel like that has happened because we haven't had that many people who are publicly successfully living this sort of real reflection of who they are as too Indian. So automatically, if someone is too connected, we see it as something that isn't normal, when really it is normal for so many British Indians in this country, so many. And I suppose over the years, we've been lucky to have things like the internet happen and digital platforms like social media happen, where you can live this reality and you can share that reality with people and they can connect to it. I always say that I am a result of people who are very similar to myself. It's not as if I have done something extraordinary. The extraordinary is that people have seen me and gone, I'm the same, I'm similar, or whatever. And it becomes normal then. It becomes normal when you see more people like yourself. It's about visibility. The lack of Indian visibility, the lack of Hindu visibility is so, so scary, because without being seen, people will disconnect. We live in a hugely materialistic society. Everything is so much more visual now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We are constantly looking at images. We are constantly reading things on our phone. That's the first thing most people do in British society. And I don't think British Indians are very different. So I think creating that, i.e., showing yourself, showing up as your authentic self, if you are too Indian, as some people like to call it, sort of makes it normal. There is a pressure for people to disconnect, but I think it has to be authentic, and it has to be honest in the sense that you should really not paint this picture perfect idea or romanticized idea of India. I think from my personal experience with my audiences, they very much like it when you do point fingers at your own culture, at your own heritage, and say that this isn't quite right, but it has to be done in a responsible way. We need to understand, well, why did those things happen? What do they mean now? Why have they become rigid, or, you know, or why are we losing our heritage? And those conversations need to be had. Only then will more and more people feel confident and comfortable to come out. I don't want to be the only Gujarati YouTuber in this country. I don't want to be a limited select set of Hindus who openly talk about Hindu festivals. I would like a break from it, if I'm honest with you. And at times there's been a pressure for me to be more Indian when I might not be at that stage in my journey or day of the week. So I feel like having just even conversations like this will show people, well, actually, Laxmi's gone and done all these, you know, things out in India. This is something I want to do. So it's about creating that visibility. But yeah, there is a stigma attached to being too Indian. I will definitely say that there's certain jobs that I've had to apply for where you almost have to remember that, oh gosh, I'm working with white people now. I have to tone down my brightness and boldness. But then I also got to a stage where I'm like, this cannot be sacrificed. I can't dress down or in clothes or change my, do you know what I mean, my diet to appease your ideas of what you want me to be. So you learn that when you make those sacrifices, it really feels like someone's ripping who you are apart. So after a while, you're like, well, I don't think I want to make these sacrifices anymore. I've got the scars. I'm happy to just be who I am and take me as my authentic self. Of course, there will be times you have to, you know, be diplomatic, but choose carefully is what I would suggest.
Yeah, thanks, Parle. And yeah, I think the point you're making around, I actually feel like we're in the middle of this huge shift. You know, Parle, you grew up in the UK, so there was a time where, you know, when my mum put oil in my hair and sent me to school, seriously, it was like I wished like the ground would literally open up and take me in. And I think, you know, growing up in this time and being Indian again in this period of time, it's such a fascinating time, and there's so much scope to express yourself. I mean, what Parle is doing, you know, really to kind of, I completely relate to so many of the kind of like videos you put out and the content you put out. So I think we're in the middle of something where, you know, we're looking to be represented. We want to be understood. We want to be seen and heard, and it's possible. You know, before we were limited to shows like Goodness Gracious Me, which were really groundbreaking at that time. And now there's a chance for us to kind of, again, like push past that. But just referring to something that came up in yesterday's talk, I think Manisha ji said, which really resonated, is like, how do we define culture? And culture isn't a decoration, you know, and that really kind of like struck me. She literally said, culture is not a decoration. It's not just the clothes we wear and the food we eat and our language. It really goes much deeper in terms of how we relate to ourselves and how we also relate to other people. So I think for me, if I can be like strong in that piece of things, whether I'm wearing a salwar kameez or like a suit, or like whether I'm wearing a jandlo, or, you know, whether I'm speaking Gujarati or not, almost like is a bonus. You know, those are things of how I express my culture. But the culture piece should kind of be in me too, and in terms of how I go about my day-to-day life. So I think that's a really kind of I also listening to Parle as well, it reminded me of, I haven't had the challenge of being like too Indian, but I have had the experience of like not being Indian enough. And growing up at university, naturally there were so many societies. There's Hindu society and India society and Asian society, and I just didn't naturally connect because I felt like I wasn't Hindu enough or I wasn't Indian enough. I literally didn't wear the t-shirt, figuratively and literally. And so it was those experiences that kind of almost like pushed me to think, actually, okay, what if I don't fit? Especially if you're in your early 20s or late teens and you're trying to kind of figure out who you are. If you don't naturally connect to these systems that already exist, these groups and societies and communities that already exist, for me it really pushed me to want to like seek my own direct connection to India, and figure out, okay, if it's not defined by me being a Hindu, if it's not defined by me being a Gujarati, what does it mean for me to be Indian? And again, how, and for me that meant spending time in India. Again, that meant me wanting to be there and actually relate to people versus this like concept of India.
I love that culture isn't a decoration, and the way I look at it, and that's absolutely it's such an important point. It isn't just decoration. Simply wearing it doesn't mean that it's a part of you. For me personally, that's a part of how I express it. But it's almost like the fabric is important, but so is the thread that bounds that two pieces of fabric together, the thread that you can't really see. So fantastic point there. And I completely relate to the society thing at university as well. It's almost as if a set select crowd that were a particular type of Indian would make it through. But your experiences might be extremely, extremely different as an Indian. So you'd almost feel like, hold on a minute, but I'm not those things, but I still feel very Indian. So then where do I belong? But yeah, great points there.
I'm glad you brought it up, Laxmi, because that would have been my next question. And is there a reverse discrimination that, when you're put in a mold of not being well connected and you're considered whitewashed? I have a daughter who goes to secondary school, and she told me there is a 10-finger game of checking whether you're whitewashed or not. So questions like, do you call your parents mom and dad? Do you eat dal thrice in the week? I found it really interesting. So can there be a reverse discrimination where you are not considered, well connected? Does that happen? I mean, you're mentioning your university experiences, but could you expand on that? Both of you, maybe.
I think yeah, there is, and I feel like it's because there's more visibility now. So like youngsters almost feel like, how can you not do these things? There's people on the internet, especially with youngsters, and I come back to youngsters because I'm passionate about making sure that next generation really, something happens to them, something clicks in their head that says that I want to explore this. Because I find that 90% of youngsters who do explore it find a connection, whether it's cuisine, whether it's spirituality, whether it's dance, whether it's literature, they find that connection. But if they do that exploring, but I guess that I've also become empathetic to people who haven't, again, had those experiences like I've had, just upon meeting people who are as like not whitewashed, but who haven't had that sort of strong connection with India. But then upon hearing their story, you actually understand that they didn't have the privilege of going to India, or they don't have family out in India like I do, or they don't have grandparents here in the UK, or their parents were busy working, in shops their whole life, that they've not had that sort of regular interaction with their parents. They have a distance connection with their parents, and the limited connection of India has been through, I don't know, something like Indian cinema. So they've not always had that. So I have become empathetic, but yeah, there is a pressure. I think it is both ways, but I think the pressure generally isn't to be more Indian, it's to be less Indian, if I'm honest with you, especially here in the UK. it's definitely, if you're too Indian, then it's seen as, well, we don't live in India, so why are you so Indian type thing. Yeah.
Right. Laxmi, would you like to add to that?
No, I don't think I can add much more to that actually. But I really like what Parle said about just having some empathy. Not everybody has. We've got three of us here. That's just three of us, and we've grown up and probably grown up in such different ways. And so I think empathy is really important. Whether it's kind of you feel connected to India, it's a spectrum versus this kind of very linear kind of black or white tick box. If we want to tick that box, we've got forms, plenty of forms that kind of push us into this little box. I think we have to kind of look beyond that, and also kind of respect and value that everybody's experiences are different, and they're at a slightly different point of their journey. But again, I think it comes back to this piece around, like, as a community or as our generation, like what are those kind of things that we're going to build on the foundations that our grandparents have built and our parents have built, to make it a little bit easier for a young person if they did want to express themselves, if they were interested in Navratri, or if they're interested in learning how to cook a particular Indian cuisine. Like, what are those pathways really that we're going to create so that they can explore without feeling like they shouldn't, or they're not allowed, or they don't know where to go, or they have to go all the way to India to do that. So if anything, I think there's an opportunity for us here as like a wider community to kind of figure it out.
I think just coming off the back of that, sorry, I'm ranting on here. That whole idea of empathy is so important. So, along with all the comedy stuff I do, I was really adamant that, look, I don't want to turn into some sort of figure that is just obsessed with doing funny things about our people. And in fact, before I started doing any work around comedy or YouTube, I was passionate about the opposite, showing the greatness about Gujarati culture or Indian culture. And when we set up Ras Rebellion, Pril and I set up Ras Rebellion, Pril Upadhyay, and we used to run competitions and dance competitions and things like that. And we used to host so many charity Garba events and things like that. And it comes back down to what you said, that culture isn't just decoration. And I remember we were making a decision about, these competitions and how people should be judged. And the first thing we said, that there will be no competition on how you were dressed, because access, people don't have, not everyone has money, not everyone has time or knows where to go to buy what we're wearing. So you can't just judge someone's passion for, Garba based on what they're wearing or how they're dressed or what's outwards, but look for someone who has that spark and that curiosity and really wants to spend time with you at the event to learn everything and ask the questions. And we really saw a positive change when we kind of had that empathetic sort of attitude, like, look, understand what their experience is and why they don't know. Don't look down on them for not knowing these things, but see how you can work alongside them at the elbow and uplift them.
Very true. Very true. So, Laxmi, you touched upon this. The global migration patterns have changed. There have been waves of migrants who have come in. And the ones that have come in more recently, do you think there is a difference in the way they connect? As in, my personal experience, my personal history, the way my social relationships are, something which Parle has been touching upon again and again, my social mobility, can I go back and forth between India and UK or wherever my ancestral homeland is? Has that changed the way we have connected, like somebody like a Gujarati family who maybe came 40, 30 years back to someone who has come now, like for a family like mine, which is a part of the IT industry. So I come in with a very different kind of educational background or financial circumstances. I live here in very different terms. So if I can say the word, I live in a different setup. My social relationships are probably more inclusive because IT work is more online. So I get to choose who I interact with, and I could be insular also. So I could probably be living here and not having a friend who is maybe from another culture. So have you noticed this difference in the connection or the different waves of migrants who have come? So maybe Laxmi, you can start and then Parle.
Yeah, sure. I think that's really interesting. And again, I think in one of the earlier talks, somebody mentioned about how we migrate, again, our parents and grandparents have migrated as a community, and so have very much kind of experienced UK life, British life, which was, such a massive, and I guess for some of our families, they came, they're twice migrants, they went to East Africa and then came to the UK. Whereas I think for like people migrating now, I can imagine it's a different experience, and it really kind of depends on kind of what's your kind of support system around you. And again, what are the pieces of like India you want to, or your values or culture you want to continue? Like I know, Manu, you've mentioned having young children, and the idea of kind of like what do I want to kind of give to them? What are they gonna remember about India? What I find interesting about this is maybe sometimes there are some things I struggle with, which is how like maybe second, third generations maybe treat and react and respond to maybe more recent people that have migrated from India to the UK. And there are words like, fresh off the boat and freshy, which I personally just find really, really tough to even hear or to even say out loud. And so I think there's almost this hierarchy of we've made it, and whether that's kind of Hindus and Indians are generally known as the model minority. We're seen as successful, seen as stable. We're the ones that have high attainment of education and have maybe made it into like politics, and so when I think about how we look at ourselves, and then even within there's this kind of like hierarchy of success. And integration, and finding that perfect balance of being Indian but not too Indian, but also adjusting to British life. I sometimes kind of struggle with how we look at and treat people who might come with a different experience, who are looking to maybe now start their journey in the UK. So I absolutely do feel like they're very different experiences. And I think also depending on which state you've come from, it might vary. It's not something I can speak to. And I think, Manu, you're probably like the best person to speak to that. But I feel like being Gujarati or even like Punjabi communities, because, both of these communities have been here for quite a long time, there's a level of establishment, that's happened over those years. But I think if you're coming from other parts of India, I genuinely think it's quite tough, and there's another level of adjustment that happens.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, especially that them and us sort of system, where a lot of the established Gujarati or Indian communities here feel like, well, actually these new Indians are different, and they are different, and the differences aren't negative or positive, but they're just different. They've come during a different world climate, they've come during a different British climate, they've come in from a different backdrop in India in terms of education or class or aspiration as well. My parents came from India because there was very limited prospect for them in India, and they felt that they have this privilege of being African born, but actually they lived in India, and now they've got the opportunity to move to Britain. So Kenya, where they were both born, didn't work. India was extremely difficult, but they had this opportunity to come to Britain, so they took it on board. But the new migrants that are coming from India, which are hugely important, and I'm really passionate about the new migrants, just because I feel like the fact that we have this established community can be taken as a positive. We've got these big wide arms where we should be welcoming these new communities in and saying that, hey, there's some people exactly like you in one sense in this country, even though we are very different in another way, we can still accept you and help you in ways that you might not know is possible. But there is that them and us, and I always say that we need to be very careful in terms of when we're talking about migrant communities, because a lot of the time it turns into the East Africans of the 70s, or the North Indian community of the 1950s, and there's so much more to that. The migration story of Indians in the UK it's constant. There's a sizable population that comes to the UK every year and settles here and starts life. And I suppose, again, that's why I'm really passionate about language content. Again, don't want to use the word language, but I'm passionate about content in Gujarati or Hindi that comes from Britain, to welcome those communities in, to make sure that they don't have another excuse for losing their vernacular like we might have.
Very, very interesting. I would like to share a funny story. I mean, I think I've learned more about India by being away from India, because when we were in the US, we were selling off an old computer that we had, and this elderly American gentleman who came to buy, and he was writing this check, and he assumed that our last names were Patel. It took a lot of convincing to tell him that not all Indians are Patels. So I can relate to that part of, being that smaller or maybe a sub community of the larger Indian state, which has not established themselves. And the assumption that I would know how to do Dandiya and Garba, I actually hadn't seen Garba or Dandiya till I came to the US and UK. So of course, about that long arms and embracing, I've had Gujarati friends. I have friend Sagar Gilani who actually told me, I'm going to teach you Manu Ben how to do that Dandiya. So that's been a pleasant experience, and I've learned and seen so much of India here, which is really, it's an important point to note. Now, my next question would be that, through this acultural, you come to this country and you have the subsequent generations who integrate into this. And Laxmi, you've been talking about the next generations. So is there a struggle where you feel as if you're in between cultures? Is there a sangharsh? And then how do you find that balance between the culture of your ancestral homeland and that of your host country or your host culture? There is definitely a dilemma which arises. Maybe there is some sort of a struggle, there is a vishad. So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, I don't mind. I don't mind sharing some thoughts here. And I think when I've physically been living in India, and initially it was just short stints, like 3 months and like 6 months, I didn't necessarily feel a struggle because I always knew I was going to come back to the UK. So coming back to this idea of a safety net, and UK was home, and India was a place I was kind of getting to know, and figuring things out. And as I started spending more time in India, I think the last time when I went to India and I kind of decided I'm going for an indefinite period of time, I don't know when I'm going to go back to the UK, but I don't want to go with this idea of, I always have, I am always going to have, I'm lucky to have, 2 places as a home. It's only when I made that distinction in my head did I feel quite unanchored, because, we relate to the UK as, like we've said, like this migrant community. The language for us in India is we're the diaspora, the NRIs, and even NRIs has so many different meanings. And so, where do we fit? Where do we belong? So I definitely feel at points I have felt that little bit of confusion around like, who am I? Where do I belong? And, this conversation has been going on for like probably several decades now, this idea of like, no man's land, and we're really kind of limited to our passport, really. But actually, if you flip it, like I feel now that I don't feel like now I need to balance things so much. I've had like 35 plus years in the UK. So the UK and, life here, even like the British Indian life here is very much in me. That's why I actually felt I need to spend more time in India, really, because that's the part of me that I want to explore more. And actually, I think we're in a really interesting position where, we do have a passport that enables us to kind of experience everything in this quite, again, privileged way, really, that we get to go to India, we get to spend time in the UK. And I don't necessarily feel that conflict as I did maybe when I was younger. I think what's interesting is how I see things and how other people are seeing what I'm doing. So I always get asked, like, when are you coming home, and where do you see, where's home for you, and do you want to live in India permanently? And to be honest, they're just really big questions for me. I don't think I have answers to them. But for me, I think we're just lucky again that we've been brought up. The way Parle described it was beautiful. His family have like literally dripped fed him, this beautiful culture. And I'm the same. I've been very lucky to have that. So I've never really felt like I've needed to balance it as such. I don't know if that answers your question. Actually, I feel like it might have gone on a detour.
No, it does. It actually shows that you're very connected to yourself. So you are at a place of peace. You know exactly where you are now, and you have struck that right balance. So Parle, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, it's very similar for me. I'm not under this pressure now where I'm like, I need to do more to connect to India, or I need to do less to connect to India. Like the way my mum would say it, in Gujarati is Gharma Besta Sikho, meaning like learn to sit in your home. And that just basically means that, yes, whilst you are part of wider British society, the amount of time you spend outside your home, it should be in good balance to what you spend inside your home. And that's how I do it. Like being a part of British society, or being a part of the fabric of the UK as someone who's born here, is something that I do. But then connecting to my Indianness happens also because I spend enough time at home, and home is a reflection of my Indian culture. So I think I've struck that balance, and sometimes that balance does go off, whatever, but it does come back to the middle. And yeah, I suppose that's the way I look at it.
There is a question which is related to the fact that studies have shown that if we are connected to our families and our communities and our cultural heritage, there is a general sense of well-being. We heal faster, we have a stronger immunity. So the question is that we've been talking about India so far, and we are in a privileged position that we have a cultural heritage to connect with. What advice would you give migrants from other nationalities who perhaps have lost their cultural heritage? Parle, Laxmi, who would?
Again, yeah, I think it's things that we both maybe already have suggested. So I apologize if it's slightly repetitive, but I think it really is like this idea of curiosity, like that you have to be curious. You can't force these things. And again, like it's down to that one individual or that group of people. Like Parle suggested, it was two of them who started Ras Rebellion, right? But it took two people, and it's just two people. It's not a massive, there's no like committee and no governance board and like regular meetings. It's just two people who've sat there and thought, this is missing, can I do something about it, and taken a step. So I think a sense of ownership I think is important around anything, like recognizing it's not somebody else's issue to deal with. Somebody else will do it. Somebody else will start Gujarati lessons for the kids, or somebody else will start Bharatanatyam classes for the future. I think it very much is like our issue, our challenge, and I think we have to take some ownership around that. So for whoever it is, I think one, being just curious, again, being curious about what are those things you were interested in, what are those things you want to preserve and continue. And again, I keep on coming back to this. We're so lucky that we're constantly, consciously or subconsciously, we get to select which parts of our homeland we want to continue and we want to preserve. But I'd be really surprised if there's not just one single thing, an idea, and that even one or two people can't do something with. But I think it does require a level of commitment. I think it's important, again, if we think about our previous generations, we used to do Garba in like a community hall, but Garba would happen. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't like a band. It was literally a tabla person, a harmonium, and singers that were from within the community, and so, but they made it happen. And that was a level of dedication that was so visible in those previous generations. And I genuinely believe that's the kind of dedication and perseverance it will take for us or any migrant community to kind of like move things along.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I know we're running out of time, but it comes down to one thing that I learned, and I actually lived in Australia for 6 years, so that's a whole other story, being British, East African, Indian, growing up in Australia for 6 years. But I did something wonderful there. My whole family did. We joined something called the Chinmo Mission, and our Gurudev said to us that one of the most important things you will learn, and this is his quote, that the world is a reflection of your own mind. And that I've held that so close to me. And by that, I mean to say that it all starts with you. There's no perfect place to start, perfect time to start, perfect position to start in, but just start. And it comes back down to what Laxmi has so nicely put, that curiosity needs to be there. So even if it's a small amount of curiosity, pull on that string and see where it takes you.
That was very beautiful. Thank you. But I am very conscious of the time, but there are two questions that I must take. One, there's this audience question, which I think is very important, and that is, how is mass media influencing our ongoing relationships with our homeland? And that is an interesting one, because we might, if we rely only on mass media, we have some very romantic ideas about our ancestral homeland, and that might not be true. And that's why it's related to another question that said that, is India changing? Is the diaspora more traditional than those in India these days? And how is India itself shifting culturally in terms of language, etc.? So please share your thoughts on this.
If it's about language, I'll jump in quickly. Again, I know we're short of time. Yes, the language is 100% changing in India. When I've written content for India, I have to actually add more English into the dialogue, believe it or not. Whereas here we use some old Gujarati words, as they would put it. And in terms of the mass media, I come back down to visibility. We still do not have enough Indians or Hindus in the media to add a very nuance. So what happens is what I call conveyor belt media, where there's not enough influence, there's not enough pressure, and so they rely on a very tick box sort of approach to dealing with anything from India. As long as they've done something or spoken about it very wishy-washily, it's done. So support people who are trying to, create visibility, create opportunity, and follow them through their entire journey to just see what the end goal is, to see what they're trying to do. That's what I would say to that. Yeah.
Laxmi?
I'm going to try and make this super quick as well. But again, coming back from like the media point, and I think in the last few years especially, and I think especially with like Modi ji coming into power and his use and that government's use of like media, I think has definitely had like an influence on like us and how we're relating to India and seeing it as more of a superpower, seeing it more as like a success story. So I do feel mass media does influence the way we're seeing India. I think it is really important though to say that this is just like one layer, and that it's like an iceberg and we're literally seeing like the tip of it, because that's what social media, mass media is. It tells us one story. So I really do think it's important to kind of push past that. And coming to your second question, which I think is like really interesting around like, is India changing? I think so. Like the India that I was experiencing was very different to the Indian culture I was experiencing in the UK. And one of the things that became very clear to me very early on in the time that I was spending there is India doesn't need us. India very much exists just fine between elections and cricket matches and festivals and all these significant things that happen for us as diaspora. It continues just fine. It's moving at its own pace in the way that it will. I feel that sometimes we see it as this two-way relationship, but that takes a little bit more effort. Right now, I feel like it's more of a one-way love from us, because we're trying to hold on to our culture. But India is really just doing its thing just fine with or without, diaspora feeling connected to it or not.
My final question, and I promise this is the last one. Do we owe anything to our ancestral homeland? I mean, in the dharmic context, there is a dharma towards our karma bhumi, which would be maybe Britain here in this context where we are working, we are earning, and then the janma bhumi. We might not literally have been born in India, but there is a spiritual connection, there is a dharmic connection. So do we owe something to our janma bhumi?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because I've never really, I haven't thought about India through this lens of dharma. But for me, if my understanding of dharma is duty or truth, let's just say, I don't think, and again, for me personally, it's not connected to any one single place. I think it's wherever I am. And my interpretation of it is literally like turning up. And by turning up, I don't mean like physically being there. I think for me, it means trying to, give my best self to wherever I am. And if I'm able to do that in that moment in time, for me, that would honestly be fulfilling my dharma, or my understanding of what seva is, just generally not limited to a day or, a couple of months in India. So again, for me, it's not bound to any place. I think really like I can be fulfilling my dharma anywhere I am, actually, just by, again, being fully present and trying to like give the best of me to that situation.
Yeah, so I think because coming back to the first point I made, because India is my Matrubhumi, the UK is my Karmabhumi and Janmabhumi, and that is who I am. Living a dharmic life wherever I am will benefit India in the long run anyway, or benefit the UK in the long run anyway, or wherever I'm working, as long as I am leading a life of dharma or hoping to do so, or on that path, the long-term effect of that is going to benefit India. So you are naturally doing that anyway if you are living by that idea of India being your Matrubhumi. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a visible type of thing that I'm doing, but it's happening anyway, if that makes sense.
That's really beautiful. I have to thank both of you for such a deep, insightful conversation. I think the biggest takeaway from this conversation is that connection is not just necessary for rootedness or continuity. It is a fundamental human need. It's important for our well-being, for our community's well-being, and there are different ways to connect. We have to find our own way, which is the best one for us. So thank you very much, Laxmi and Parle. And for those who would like to know more about Tattva or have any thoughts about this conversation, they can drop us a line on hello@tattva.org.uk, or we will be posting a link on the YouTube channel where you can submit your thoughts. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.